We often talk about porting video games from one system to another, but one example of a port might be taking a game that uses physical components and creating a video game version. A prime example might be the board game Monopoly. The objective of the game is to roll the dice, move around the board, buy properties, and eventually remove all other opponents from the game by helping them lose all their money. It requires a basic knowledge of math. One benefit of playing an electronic version of this board game is the fact that the game can do the math for you. A second benefit is that you can play against one or more computer opponents if you're playing the game alone, or with friends and would prefer having additional competitors. There are 8 player slots in the NES version that can be filled with any combination of human and/or computer opponents, totaling 2 to 8. You can even set up a game that consists of all computer opponents and just watch the computer play if you prefer. And if you think about what a computer opponent needs to do in order to play the game, one critical and potentially complex requirement comes to mind. Trading properties is a major part of Monopoly. Having a Monopoly means owning all the properties from the same color family on the board, or perhaps owning both of the utilities or all 4 railroads. It is very possible throughout the course of a game that you may end up with 2 of the 3 properties and an opponent has the 3rd property that you need. In this case, you could propose a trade to the other player saying, "Hey, I want Tennessee Avenue," and then either offering something they might want or asking what they would like in return. This requires a bit of thinking on the part of the offeree. They wonder, how can this trade help me? What do I need? Would this give my opponent a monopoly? Am I comfortable with that? If I trade this property to them, how many houses can they buy right now? Among other things. This part of the game is subjective, as the offeree may think several trades ahead and plan to make an offer of their own to a third competitor. With this sort of complexity and subjectivity, let me ask you, and many of you are programmers, how would you program some sort of artificial intelligence for the purpose of trading in a video game version of Monopoly? This would involve accepting, rejecting, or countering a trade from another player and even proposing a trade. It's a tall order. The task involves taking the subjective and making it objective, with perhaps a bit of wiggle room. Oh, and by the way, this is on an 8-bit system without native floating point support or built-in operations for division or multiplication. If you're a math person or a programmer, we're going to hit some nuts and bolts of NES Monopoly that I'm sure you will enjoy. If you're not in this crowd, well, just sit tight. We'll have all this done in time for supper. I figured there would probably be a lot of code involved for trade operations in Monopoly that would take a long time to investigate, but this took a long time. A long time. This is just some of the code involved in trading, to be honest. I also spent about as much time as I felt I could on this before making a video, so some sections might not be perfect, but the important stuff should be there. Well, shall we? To propose a trade, press select on the controller, go to Properties, Trade, and select an opponent, a computer opponent for our example. I, the human player in slot 3, am proposing a trade to the computer player in slot 2. This is the trade screen. The offerer is up top, and the offeree is on bottom. We need an example trade in order to parse the code, so let's start by proposing a trade that doesn't really make sense in the context of gameplay, but is good for the numbers that we will see. Here is the current breakdown of properties for the 2 parties. I have Vermont Avenue. My opponent has Connecticut Avenue. Nobody has purchased Oriental Avenue yet. Let's trade Vermont for Connecticut. I initiate the trade by selecting Yes. The ball is now in the computer's court. The game recognizes the need for computer intervention and executes the trade analysis code. We'll pick up that code here. I have a lot of code to trace. Some of it will involve a code walk for a few lines. Some of it I will generalize what a block of code does. Feel free to pause it at any time to read the comments, and I highly recommend watching this on a larger screen as I've crammed a lot of information into the frame. I'll keep track of some of our finds on the right as we proceed. Okay, this small area at the start sees that the trade candidate is a computer, loads the appropriate destination in the ROM, and jumps to that destination, which is here. This area is a code depot that does a lot of processing. You can see that I haven't commented or labeled much here at the start, and that is because we're going to quickly make a couple of jumps downward and reach check player asset scores before trade. Now at this point, you can see things start to get real. When you see that I've added multi-line comments and blank spaces between code blocks, that means the logic involved could be tough to follow at just a glance. This compare asset scores sub, which returns a value, so feel free to call it a function, is responsible for examining the assets, both properties and cash, for both players involved in the trade. It checks mortgages, houses or hotels on properties on the trade table, everything. 0 is used as a parameter that tells the function to calculate the current player assets for the players involved in the trade. Later, we will see the same function called to calculate future player asset scores if this trade would occur. But this first one is for scoring player assets right now. Let's jump in. We start with a bit of initialization, as expected, for several indices and counters. We need to loop through all of the property groups to create a score using their values for each of the 2 players in the trade. Groups would be railroads, utilities, and then the color groups like dark blue, with Boardwalk and Park Place, for example. Groups are ordered based on their first occurrence on the board while moving clockwise from go. First up is the Baltic and Mediterranean group. Next would be the 4 railroads, etc. So to the code for group 1, this section here takes that 1, calculates an offset, and places it in X. For each group, there is a maximum of 4 possible slots, because the largest number of properties involved in a single monopoly is 4 in the case of railroads. For our first group, Mediterranean Avenue and Baltic Avenue, the slots are Mediterranean, Baltic, empty, empty. The order in the slots is in the same order as you move clockwise from go. The first thing we do with the Monopoly group offset is find the property offset. It is just a picnic of offsets so far. X begins at the highest slot, so we get nothing, and we move to the next slot. We get nothing again and move to the next slot. Now we've hit Baltic Avenue. Our second offset, Y, is 3 for Baltic. So we go to parameter branch. When we entered this huge section a moment ago, this function call used a parameter of 0, so we branch to property check. Okay, if we pause to catch our breath here, all that's happened so far is that we found various values and offsets until we finally have our first property to process, Baltic Avenue. Now we can process it. We have some relevant information for the property. The single byte for each property contains the following. For a highest bit of 7 and a lowest bit of 0, the values are: bit 7 is set if the property is owned. Bit 6 is set if the property is mortgaged. Bits 5, 4, and 3 combine to form a 3-bit value that indicates any bonuses to its rent. 0 is none, 1 means there's a monopoly, 2 means there's one house on the property, etc. The final 3 bits, 2, 1, and 0, are used for the player ID that owns the property. Values range from 0 to 7. In the case of Baltic Avenue, things are a bit anticlimactic as nobody owns it. Guess what? Nobody owns Mediterranean Avenue either. I'll continue the looping and spare walking you through the index logic. Okay, we are now processing the railroad group. Nobody owned Shortline, but someone does own B&O. So when we reach our property check section, we now have an owner for the property, player 2, the computer that we're trading. The owner ID for the current property is saved off into a temporary array for the current group. The array's size is flexible, and it can grow to a maximum size of 4, of course. So all our logic is really doing at this moment is looping through the entire board and recording the owner IDs for every property that is owned. In addition, if the property is mortgaged, this section would add to the discount score that would be applied after asset score calculation. I left this out of our example for simplicity, but know that it exists. B&O isn't mortgaged, so we move on to the next property in the railroad group. Pennsylvania Railroad is owned by a player that is not part of the trade. It is still written to the temporary array. After processing all the properties in the railroad group, we reach this finished property group section. This block loops back through the owner IDs we saved off for the railroad group and counts the number of properties owned by each player involved in the trade. After looping the 2 properties in the array, the owner count is me, 0, and the computer, 1, for railroads. The block of code after that combines the count for both parties into a single byte and saves it to RAM at the appropriate location for the property group. This is done for each group on the board, and each group has its own byte in RAM that contains a count of properties owned by both party members in the trade. We end up with a block of bytes in RAM where each byte represents a property group and each byte is split into 2 nibbles. The high nibble contains the offeree's number of properties in that group, and the low nibble contains the offerer's number of properties in that group. Now, it is time to use the properties owned to add up a score for each player in the trade. For this, we start at the highest property group on the board, Boardwalk and Park Place, and work backwards. I own one of these, Boardwalk. So we get to the appropriate place in code that finds the proper offset for owning one dark blue property and use it to get a score from the lookup table. Here are the values in the lookup table. I wrote them in decimal and placed their hexadecimal equivalents underneath. One dark blue property, either Boardwalk or Park Place, results in an asset score of 26. Now, in the case of the dark blue properties, owning only two of them gets you a monopoly. So if I owned two dark blue properties, both Boardwalk and Park Place, the offset would move over 1 byte, and the player's score for owning both properties in this dark blue group would be 193. You can see just how much the score a player gets for each group is affected by how many properties are owned in the group. In the case of the dark green properties, the scores are 18 for a single property, 36, 18 times 2, for two properties, and then 171 for a dark green monopoly. I found these values fascinating because they clue us in on just how much the computer values a monopoly for a given property group versus owning a sum of individual properties that is short of a monopoly. Owning two dark green properties versus 3 has a notable difference in score. If we continue scoring and add all of the appropriate score values together for both the offerer and the offeree, we reach the next section. It handles mortgaged property discounts or penalties to the player's score. You already know this could exist, let's not worry about it. I didn't mortgage any properties, so I could leave this part out for simplicity. Next up is generating an appropriate score using cash assets and applying it to the total asset score for each player. The code involved in this is an absolute eye-opener. Okay, let's say a player has this much cash. In order to find their cash asset score, we want to take 5% of this cash value and cap the result at $255. How would you do that in code? Using pseudocode not tied to a particular language alongside an array that holds each player's cash amount and an index representing the current player's ID, you could write something like this. 3 lines of code. Get the current player's cash, find 5% of it, and cap it off. Don't get hung up on the data types, naming conventions, etc. This is just pseudocode for a process. With the 5% value now available, you are free to proceed with score calculation. But what if you wanted 5% of a given player's cash score with the player's cash value having each digit split across multiple bytes, and needed to perform the operation using 6502 assembly without any multiplication or division operations available? It would maybe take this much code. We won't do a detailed walk through this, but here's the overview. The logic sets a pointer to the appropriate player's cache location, copies that cache value to a temporary location in RAM for operational purposes, changes the pointer so it's pointing to that temporary location, divides the cache value by 10. This is done by taking each digit of the cache value contained in separate bytes and copying each of them to another new location in RAM while conveniently moving each of them over to the right 1 byte. Easy division by 10. The leading digit in the new temp location is manually zeroed out. This 10% value is then cut in half to make it 5%. How is that done? Division by 2 is a staple of sorts in binary arithmetic. Best way to illustrate this? We go old school. Seriously, like 4th grade. It's time for long division. If you divide 350 by 2, and here we go, 2 goes into 3 once. 2 times 1 is 2. Subtract them and you get 1. Bring down the 5. 2 goes into 15 7 times. 7 times 2 is 14. 15 minus 14 is 1. Carry down the 0. 2 goes into 10 5 times. 175. Our digits in RAM are contained in separate bytes. Digit by digit division, like in this analog example, is a good illustration of what happens in code. Binary is a base 2 system, so dividing by 2 is accomplished by shifting the bits to the right 1 place using LSR, logical shift right. So to start our example, the binary value of 3 looks like this. How many times does 2 go into 3? Shift the bits to the right and you get 1. A carry has shifted out to the right. So for the next digit, 5, that carry from the previous LSR, a value of 10, is added to create 15. Kind of similar to how in long division you carry down and merge the next digit with the leftovers from the previous subtraction. Take the binary value of 15, shift it right. You get 7 with another carry. Then 10 divided by 2 is 5. Binary division by 2. We now have our 5% value. But we're not done yet. Whatever value results from the 5% needs to be capped at 255 and is still spread across multiple bytes. So, additional logic is performed to check this 5% of cash assets result against $254. If the percentage exceeds it, the value is capped at 255, and the separate digits are converted into a single byte. And the single byte is added to the asset score for the player. If you were programming this using modern languages, your fingers would be done typing all the code without even thinking about it. For the same operation in 6502 assembly on the NES, unless you or your development house already had some functions available for performing some of the basic operations included here alongside game-specific logic, you most likely had to sit there and design all of this and then implement it. As an aside, some time ago I noticed that the linear feedback shift register logic in The Legend of Zelda used for random number generation in the game was also implemented in Tetris using the exact same code. The code isn't too complex, it's a relatively common operation in assembly and could potentially just have been memorized by 6502 savvy programmers, but it is still quite normal to expect that standard functions were made available to any projects Nintendo developed. Maybe the software they used for development or a reference book just happened to have this rather common operation in it, or maybe Nintendo developed a few in-house functions and naturally had those available for any software projects that needed them. No sense reinventing the wheel. As for NES Monopoly, hopefully programmer Bill Williams didn't have to write all this code from scratch. Anyway, let's get back to trade logic. The same 5% cash logic that was performed for the offerer is performed for the offeree. Now things finally get really real. The difference of the two asset scores is found by subtracting them. The compare assets function returns which of the two players involved in the trade is favored. FF means the offeree is favored. 01 means the offerer is favored. The difference between the scores, as well as which party is favored prior to a trade occurring, is copied to another place in RAM. A few lines down, the same operation is performed by calling the same function, compare asset score sub, with a different parameter. We won't walk through that whole thing again, but basically the subroutine scores asset strength for the two parties if this would-be trade took place, and factors any possible cash that would change hands into the 5% asset score. So long as there are no houses or hotels on the properties involved in the trade, it is time to compare the difference of differences. That is to say, we will take the difference in asset scores of the two parties before the trade and compare it to the difference in asset scores after a would-be trade. Would there be a change in power if this trade occurred? Who would it favor? If it favors the computer will likely accept. If it favors the human player and did not favor that player previously, well, the computer may propose a counteroffer or straight up reject the trade. The key values returned here in the accumulator are FF, trade accepted, or 0, trade rejected. This location, F6A2, that holds a 0 for a rejected trade could be modified with a Game Genie code so it loads FF instead of 0. In other words, all proposals to the computer with an offer on both sides of the table would be accepted with that Game Genie code in place for the rejection logic. Game Genie or not, the computer accepts the trade that I just walked you through. Here's the breakdown of values involved during the AI's examination of the trade. No cash changed hands, no properties were mortgaged, no houses or hotels were built, and no monopolies were involved. So this is a pretty simple breakdown of scores. Although the idea of trading properties from the same family across the table makes no sense, the computer evaluated the trade and determined it was acceptable. A moment ago, I said that the Game Genie code usage to override trade rejection would kick in if there were an offer on both sides of the table. Let's talk about some of the other trade situations. Under normal circumstances, if you select a computer's property for trade without offering something in return and select yes, The computer will examine your properties and cash and potentially select a property and/or cash and attempt to create a fair trade that most likely benefits them over you. If you've played the game before, you may have experienced the computer proposing a trade like this by selecting one of your properties and checking yes. This isn't meant to be an instance of the computer saying, "Give me this property for free," but rather the computer simply saying, "I'm interested in this." On occasion, you may have experienced two computer players involved in a trade. Sometimes they will continue to make counteroffers in order to reach an agreement. However, sometimes you'll notice that they get stuck between two counteroffers. Fortunately, there appears to be a built-in counteroffer counter of sorts that limits the negotiations so the computers aren't stuck in an infinite loop forever that prevents you from playing the game. While the trade AI in Monopoly may seem a bit crude by today's standards, I felt that it was overall pretty good, if not exploitable, 30 years ago. And speaking of exploitation, let's wrap up by walking a scenario used by speedrunners for NES Monopoly. Yes, speedrunning Monopoly. What do you think the world record is for this game? Well, as of this video, it's just over 46 seconds. This can be accomplished thanks to an exploitation of the computer's trade AI. Here's a typical scenario. Create a two-player game with one human player and one computer player. For the computer player, use Ollie. You then want to press Select, menu to Game Control, and toggle the Hurry option to speed up the computer. The objective is for each player to own one light blue property, with the human player ultimately landing on the third light blue property after the first two have been purchased. This should occur within the first 3 turns. As an example, let's say you go first, roll a 6, land on and purchase Oriental Avenue. Next, Ollie rolls an 8, lands on and purchases Vermont Avenue. For your next turn, you roll a 3 and land on Connecticut. At this point, each of you have one light blue property, and you have the ability to buy the third in the set. And this is where the trade AI exploitation comes into play. First, obtain Vermont Avenue from Ollie, propose a trade for Vermont, check yes, let him select a dollar value, and accept the trade. Now you have 2 light blue properties. Next, buy Connecticut Avenue. Then, mortgage all 3 properties. Finally, trade all 3 mortgaged light blue properties back to Ollie in exchange for all of his money. He will accept. As part of the acquisition of mortgaged property, the receiving player must pay 10% interest on the mortgage. The problem is Ollie has no money. Therefore, he is bankrupt. You win. Easy. Well, easy if your dice rolls work out and everyone lands on the right properties. Since we know how the trade AI works, let's see how this is possible. The first trade that occurs is for Vermont. Ollie selects the cash he wants. I haven't reverse engineered the trade suggestion code, but it is inconsequential. The real trade of interest occurs after mortgaging the 3 properties and trading them all for Ollie's money. Let's check the numbers. Here are the before and after scores for this trade. You can see how tilted things are in favor of the human player before the trade. The computer has no property score at all, as all 3 assets currently in possession of the players belong to the human player. With a rather minimal penalty thanks to mortgaged property and the cash assets that currently favor the computer, the overall asset score shows that the computer is in a rather bad spot, despite the fact it, A, has plenty of cash to spend, and B, there are many properties left on the board. That said, if the trade were to take place, there would be a very noticeable shift in asset score in favor of the computer. The trade AI has a case of tunnel vision with this trade, thanks to the shift in asset score that would occur after the trade. It does not account for the fact that it will have no money to pay the interest for the mortgaged properties it acquires. Therefore, Ollie is now bankrupt. Regardless of its platform, Monopoly is a game where the rules, objectives, and basic operation are known. When it comes to trading, things get a bit subjective. Monopoly on the NES used a scoring system to help determine the computer's course of action when a trade is proposed. The system isn't perfect, but it does bring the question of updating old video games. Sometimes the community creates patches for bugs or quality of life hacks for a game. Is there a desire to see a more refined trade AI in NES Monopoly? It seems like the target audience would be rather niche, as Monopoly is a board game that has been ported to many systems over the years. While perhaps a large group of gamers desiring a smarter NES Monopoly AI does not exist, it would make for an interesting exercise for those of you interested in taking on a programming task for an old NES game. Well, that was a journey. I hope you enjoyed this meandering through some of the trade AI in Monopoly. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, please like the video and leave a comment so the YouTube trade AI proposes this video to potential viewers. I also have a Patreon available for this channel. Until next time, thanks for watching.